My name is Genevieve York. I'm 38 years old, a financial analyst by profession, but more than that, I've always been the unofficial glue holding my adoptive family together. It's a role I never asked for, but somehow it fell on me, being the calm in the storm, the organizer behind every family event, the one who quietly manages budgets and smooths conflicts no one else wants to face. For years, I've tried to keep peace within our family, hoping that by being dependable and selfless, I'd finally feel like I belonged. I was adopted as a baby, raised by the Yorks, Martin and Linda, and I have an older sister, Rachel, their biological child. From early on, I sensed I was different, not just because of my quiet nature or the way I processed the world, but because family dynamics subtly reminded me I was the outsider. It was never blatant, at least not at first. But little things, like who got praise at a dinner, who got invited to certain outings, whose opinions mattered, those things piled up. Still, I held on to hope that blood didn't mean everything, that love and loyalty could bridge any difference. Professionally, I've spent the last 15 years immersed in numbers and budgets, navigating complex financial landscapes for a nonprofit organization. I'm meticulous. If there's a spreadsheet to be created or a crisis to be diffused, I'm the person who steps up. That skill spilled over into family life, where I became the person who tracked bills, organized gatherings, and even bailed out relatives when money got tight. I was proud, in a quiet way, that my family leaned on me, but the weight of that responsibility is heavier than it looks, especially when gratitude feels scarce. The latest family dinner made that painfully clear. It was a cool autumn evening when I arrived at the restaurant. The Yorks often choose upscale places for our gatherings, places where appearances matter. Rachel was already there, surrounded by family and friends, her laugh loud and easy, the center of attention as usual. I walked toward the table, balancing a small gift and my best attempt at a smile. I was ready to play my part, the dutiful daughter, the peacemaker, the one who never causes waves. But as I approached, Rachel's voice cut through the background chatter like ice. "Go find another table," she said, her tone sharp, eyes cold. "This one's for the real family." The room froze for a heartbeat. Then laughter bubbled up, cruel and disbelief mixed into one. Heads turned. Some faces flashed surprise, others amusement. I stood there, stunned. The chair I had expected to slide into suddenly belonged to someone else, or rather, belonged to everyone but me. The words echoed in my mind, real family, as if being adopted erased years of shared memories, loyalty, and love. Before I could even process what had happened, a server approached and placed a thick folder on the table in front of me. I glanced down and saw the numbers. $3,270, the restaurant bill, the total cost of the dinner, and apparently my share of being part of this family circle. As Rachel's face twisted into a triumphant smirk, the whispered laughter around me felt like knives. My husband Tom and our 2 children sat quietly beside me, eyes wide with shock and sympathy, but there was little anyone could say in that moment. I didn't argue, didn't protest. I reached for my card and paid. The transaction was silent, but inside, my heart pounded with humiliation and disbelief. How had it come to this? How did a lifetime of love and sacrifice get reduced to a social transaction and a pointed insult? The warmth of family had turned cold, and I was left holding the bill, both figuratively and literally. That night, I went home with a quiet ache, carrying more than just the weight of a credit card receipt. I carried the sting of rejection, the sharp clarity that being family wasn't about sharing a last name or attending dinners together. Sometimes the very people who should embrace you are the ones who push you away, and sometimes you have to decide how long you'll let that happen. From the moment I was adopted as a baby, the subtle lines between family and outsider were drawn with invisible ink, only visible in the way my adoptive parents treated me compared to Rachel and their biological children. It wasn't anything they ever said outright. It was woven into the fabric of everyday moments, the kind that accumulate and shape your sense of belonging, or the painful absence of it. I remember the early holidays, the family gatherings that were supposed to be warm and inclusive, but somehow always felt like I was a shadow in the background rather than a participant in the story. My parents, Martin and Linda, would beam with pride when Rachel excelled, whether in school achievements, athletic victories, or social events, and the room would fill with praise that seemed to only echo for her. I tried to celebrate with them, to be genuinely happy, but the message was clear. Rachel was the favored child, the one who carried the family's legacy, while I was something else. On one Christmas morning, I distinctly recall sitting at the edge of the breakfast table, watching Rachel open a shiny new laptop gifted from our parents. It was the kind of gift I knew I might never receive, not because they couldn't afford it, but because I was different. Later that day, when I showed them a drawing I had made, a painting of the family tree, they smiled politely, but quickly turned their attention back to Rachel, who was sharing stories about her latest school project. Their eyes, full of warmth for Rachel, barely met mine. The message was unspoken but deafening. I was not the same. As I grew older, these subtle acts of favoritism extended beyond material things. My opinions were often dismissed or overshadowed in family conversations. If I dared to voice my dreams or achievements, they were met with lukewarm enthusiasm or worse, comparisons to Rachel's seemingly effortless successes. "Why can't you be more like her?" was a phrase whispered quietly enough to sting, but not loud enough to provoke confrontation. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just sibling rivalry or typical family dynamics, but inside, it chipped away at my self-esteem. Even the outings and social invitations were telling. Rachel and her close circle of friends had access to trips and events that I was excluded from or only invited to as an afterthought. The family vacations were planned with Rachel's preferences front and center, while mine were conveniently overlooked. I told myself this was all part of growing up, that love wasn't always perfect, that families had their quirks. But deep down, I felt like a guest rather than a daughter. My parents never explicitly said I was less, but their actions spoke volumes. The way they handled conflicts often sided with Rachel, shielding her from consequences while expecting me to be the peacemaker, the one to smooth things over and keep the peace. If Rachel faltered or made mistakes, it was brushed aside. If I stumbled, the fault was magnified. That double standard planted seeds of doubt about whether I was truly part of this family or just someone who lived under their roof. I clung to moments of affection when they came, an unexpected hug, a word of encouragement, but those moments were fleeting and rare. The subtle hierarchy was firmly in place, and it shaped every family interaction. I tried to remind myself that blood didn't make family, that love did, but when your love is met with exclusion, the heart begins to question everything. This favoritism wasn't limited to my parents. Rachel, with her charm and social prowess, often played the role of the golden child who could do no wrong. She thrived in the spotlight, while I learned to fade into the background, to be the quiet caretaker, the one who kept things running smoothly while others basked in attention. It was a role I accepted because I wanted to belong, but it came at the cost of my own visibility and voice. Looking back, I see how these early experiences of subtle exclusion set the stage for the deeper wounds and humiliations that came later. They taught me to hide my pain behind a smile and to swallow my hurt rather than confront it. I hoped that over time, love and loyalty would rewrite the story, that the family I gave my heart to would come to see me as equal, deserving of respect and inclusion. But hope, I learned, can only carry you so far. The faint echoes of favoritism in my childhood were the first cracks in a foundation I thought was solid. They shaped the way I viewed myself and my place in the York family, a place that was always just out of reach, no matter how hard I tried to claim it. And those early cracks would eventually widen, revealing how deep and painful the division truly was. If there's one thing I learned early on, it's that sacrifice was expected of me, not because anyone asked outright, but because I quietly took it upon myself to keep the family afloat. I didn't begrudge it at first. I thought, if I could just be the one who held everything together, maybe, just maybe, I'd earn my place at the table. Not the cold, distant table Rachel reserved for real family, but somewhere close enough to feel like I belonged. In my late 20s and early 30s, when many people are chasing promotions or new opportunities, I was making hard choices about where my time and energy went. Instead of pursuing a coveted executive role at my nonprofit, I deferred raises and extra work to handle aging relatives' medical appointments and household logistics. My parents, Martin and Linda, had their hands full with Rachel's whirlwind social life and business ventures, so I became the default caretaker for my adoptive grandparents and even stepped in to manage my mother's elderly aunt's finances when she fell ill. I saw it as a necessary sacrifice, a way to demonstrate loyalty, love, and responsibility. It wasn't just the caregiving. I became the family's financial backbone. Years ago, I took on the unenviable role of managing shared accounts, making sure bills were paid on time, and sorting out tax details for family properties. I kept meticulous spreadsheets tracking every expense, every loan, every repayment. The burden was heavier than I let on because these weren't just numbers. They were a tangled web of favors, expectations, and sometimes outright exploitation. One of the hardest things was the ongoing financial support I gave Rachel's husband, David. His small tech startup was struggling, more than struggling, honestly, teetering on collapse. Rachel was always quick to deflect blame and insist that, "We're handling it." But behind the scenes, I quietly loaned tens of thousands of dollars to keep the business afloat. I didn't advertise it, and certainly I didn't expect thanks. But I hoped these acts of generosity would build bridges, not walls. These were investments in family, or so I thought. Organizing family events was another part of the invisible labor I carried. From birthday parties to holiday dinners, I coordinated venues, handled catering, and even covered unexpected costs out of my own pocket when funds were tight. I didn't mind the extra work or expense. It felt like my way to contribute meaningfully, to create moments of connection where the family could celebrate and, hopefully, see me as part of the whole. Emotionally, I was always the safety net, the person relatives turned to when tensions flared. I smoothed over disputes between my parents and Rachel, mediated conflicts with extended family, and absorbed frustrations without complaint. It was exhausting, but it felt necessary to keep the fragile peace. But through all these sacrifices, the recognition I craved never came. Decisions about family matters, vacations, investments, even simple weekend plans, happened without my input. Invitations to social events often arrived late or not at all. My opinions were sought less and less, as if my role was to serve quietly, not to lead or belong. At home, the strain was palpable. My husband, Tom, watched me wear myself down trying to patch broken family ties that seemed to unravel faster than I could mend them. Our children sensed the tension too, the sadness behind my forced smiles. Yet they stood by me, offering quiet support when I needed it most. I remember one evening, a few months before that humiliating dinner, when I finally voiced my exhaustion to Tom. "I'm tired of being the one who gives and gives while everyone else takes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I just want to feel like I'm part of something real, not this shadow." Tom took my hands, his eyes steady. "You deserve to be seen, Genevieve. Not just for what you do, but for who you are." His words meant everything, and yet, returning to the family fold felt more complicated than ever. The truth was, no matter how many times I gave, no matter how much I sacrificed, the walls of exclusion remained. That $3,270 bill at the restaurant, the cruel token of rejection, didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of being the invisible caretaker, the financial guarantor, the peacemaker who was never truly embraced. In that moment, when Rachel coldly told me to find another table, I realized my sacrifices had been met not with gratitude, but with disdain. The family I had invested in so deeply saw me only as a convenient resource, someone to prop up their social image and business ventures, but not someone worthy of belonging. I paid the bill quietly, but inside a storm was brewing. I understood, painfully, that my generosity had never guaranteed acceptance. And so I began to question, how much longer would I continue to give to people who didn't see me? At what point does sacrifice become self-erasure? That night, I held my children close and wondered, was I ready to stop fading into the background? Was I ready to claim my worth no matter the cost? The answers had yet to come, but the seeds of change were quietly taking root. I remember the exact moment the room shifted during that formal family celebration, a gathering meant to honor achievements and create memories, but instead, it became the stage for one of the deepest humiliations I've endured. It was Rachel's shining moment, and I was the target carefully chosen to be diminished in front of everyone. The banquet hall was buzzing with polite conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of well-wishers congratulating family members on their latest successes. The table was elegantly set with crystal glasses and polished silverware, the ambient lighting casting a warm glow over familiar faces. Everyone was dressed to the nines, women in flowing dresses, men in tailored suits, and the air smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted lamb, mingled with the rich notes of aged wine. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, but for me, it was a trap. Earlier that evening, I had nervously shared the news about my recent promotion at work. It wasn't flashy or headline-grabbing. I had been quietly promoted to senior financial analyst at the nonprofit, where I dedicated the past decade and a half. It was the culmination of years of hard work, late nights, and balancing the relentless demands of my job with the complicated dynamics of my family life. I was proud, even if the role came without fanfare or a big salary bump. As I spoke, I noticed smiles from some relatives, nods of approval from a few close friends, but a chilling silence from the York side of the family. Then, as if sensing the perfect opportunity to deflate me, Rachel's voice cut through the room like a sharp blade. "Genevieve's promotion? It's really not a big deal," she said loudly, her tone dripping with condescension. She leaned back in her chair, a smirk curling her lips as if she'd just delivered the punchline to a joke only she understood. The words hit me like a slap. The room froze for a heartbeat. Then a few forced chuckles erupted from Rachel's closest friends. I felt every pair of eyes dart toward me, some filled with awkward sympathy, others with barely concealed amusement. The warmth I had hoped for dissolved instantly. Rachel didn't stop there. She proceeded to draw a cruel comparison, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "You know, at least our cousin Claire actually belongs here," she said loudly enough for the table to hear. "She's the one making waves, not just sitting quietly in the background." Claire, Rachel's biological cousin, was someone who, like Rachel, had the right bloodline, a fact Rachel never missed a chance to flaunt. I sat frozen, cheeks burning, mouth suddenly dry. The sting of her words was electric. "Actually belongs here," Rachel repeated, as if to hammer the point home, her voice dripping with disdain. The phrase echoed in the room, carrying the weight of years of silent exclusion and favoritism. It was a cruel reminder that no matter what I achieved, no matter how much I gave, my place in this family was always conditional, always lesser. My parents, Martin and Linda, sat nearby, their expressions unreadable. There were no words of correction, no gentle gestures of defense. Their silence spoke volumes, an unspoken endorsement of Rachel's put-down. I caught a glimpse of my mother's eyes darting away quickly, unable or unwilling to meet mine. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That stoic silence was like a wall between me and any hope of feeling truly seen. I wanted to stand up, to defend myself, to demand respect, but the words caught in my throat. The years of internalizing these subtle, simmering rejections had taught me to bite my tongue and shrink away in the face of cruelty. I swallowed hard and kept my gaze on the tablecloth, pretending the table wasn't the battleground it had become. Around me, the room slowly returned to its polite chatter, but the damage was done. Rachel's dismissal had shattered the fragile facade of family harmony. I could feel the weight of not belonging settle heavily on my shoulders, a familiar yet no less painful burden. Later, when a cousin approached me with a sympathetic smile and quiet encouragement, I forced a smile back, hiding the ache inside. That night, I lay awake, replaying Rachel's words over and over. "Not a big deal. Actually belongs here." Those phrases weren't just empty jabs. They were calculated cuts meant to remind me of my place, or the lack of it. That moment marked a subtle shift, one where I began to understand that my hopes for acceptance might always be met with rejection disguised as family banter. The humiliation was profound, not just because it was public, but because it revealed the raw truth. My family saw me not as a daughter, but as an outsider tolerated at best. I tried to rationalize it afterward, telling myself Rachel's jealousy fueled her cruelty, that deep down she was insecure, that maybe someday she'd come around. But even as that hope flickered, the cold reality settled in. This was more than just sibling rivalry. It was a clear message that no amount of success or sacrifice on my part would erase the invisible line drawn between real family and me. That night, the celebration felt like a defeat, a stark reminder that belonging isn't guaranteed by love or effort. It's granted or withheld by those who hold the power to define family. And Rachel held that power. The night of that family dinner at the upscale restaurant was one I had hoped would be just another gathering to celebrate and connect, a chance to show up as part of the family, to be seen without pretense or judgment. Instead, it became the breaking point, the moment when years of quiet exclusion exploded into cruel clarity. The restaurant's soft lighting cast a golden glow over the polished wood tables and gleaming glassware. The scent of seared steak and fresh herbs mingled with the murmur of familiar voices, laughter flowing in easy bursts among the York clan. I had arrived early, as usual, hoping to catch Rachel in a good mood, to find a moment of warmth somewhere in the room. But as soon as I stepped toward our table, her eyes locked onto me with a cold, deliberate sharpness that sent a shiver down my spine. "Go find another table," she said, her voice low but firm enough to pierce the ambient noise. She tilted her chin slightly, signaling with a casual gesture toward a corner of the room. "This one's for the real family." The words hung in the air like a slap. The room froze for a second, the clinking of silverware momentarily suspended. Then the laughter began. Quiet at first, but quickly growing louder. A cruel chorus of amusement and disbelief. Heads turned, some smiling awkwardly, others gasping in surprise, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Rachel basked in the spotlight, her smirk widening like she had just delivered the final verdict. I stood there, stunned, the chair pulled back as if erased from the map of belonging. My husband Tom's hand tightened briefly around mine, his eyes reflecting the shock and sympathy I was too numb to express. Our 2 children sat silently beside us, their faces a mixture of confusion and hurt. They didn't understand how a sister could be so unkind. Before I could respond, a server appeared and placed a thick, leather-bound folder in front of me. I blinked and opened it slowly, the weight of the leather pressing into my palms. Inside were the pages of the bill, detailed charges from every course, every drink, every shared appetizer. The total stared back at me in bold numbers. $3,270. The entire cost of the evening's feast. Now officially my responsibility. The message was clear. If I wanted to be part of this family, I had to pay the price. Literally. Rachel's eyes gleamed with triumph as she leaned back, watching my reaction with the smug satisfaction of someone who had just won a battle. "You're not just paying for dinner," she said, voice loud enough for others to hear. "You're paying for your place in this family. Because honestly, Genevieve, this table, it's for the real family." The phrase cut deeper than any insult I'd heard before. Real family. Those 2 words, repeated again and again in my mind, felt like a cold verdict, dismissing everything I'd ever done or sacrificed. The laughter around me swelled, punctuating the humiliation with a soundtrack of cruelty. I glanced around the table, catching the faces of my parents, Martin's jaw clenched, Linda's eyes flickering away, neither offering a word of defense or comfort. It was as if they had silently agreed to let Rachel's words stand unchallenged. The silence from them was louder than any protest. My heart pounded, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a deep ache that settled heavy in my chest. I felt exposed, stripped bare of the sense of family I'd clung to for so long. All the years of quiet sacrifices, the late nights spent balancing budgets, the money lent to keep Rachel's husband's failing business afloat, the family crises I'd managed behind the scenes. None of it mattered in this moment. I reached slowly for my wallet, the leather soft against my fingers, and pulled out my credit card. The transaction was silent, but inside, I was screaming. I didn't argue, didn't try to explain or defend myself. There was no point. The public humiliation was complete and irreversible. I paid the bill quietly, swallowing the lump in my throat as I slid the card back into my wallet. My hands trembled slightly, the sting of rejection sharper than any financial burden. Tom squeezed my hand gently, whispering, "You don't deserve this." But even his kindness couldn't erase the harsh truth laid bare in front of everyone. To Rachel and the family, I was an outsider, a guest who could be mocked and charged for the privilege of sitting at their table. That night, as we left the restaurant, I carried more than the weight of the credit card receipt. I carried the heavy burden of knowing that love and loyalty, no matter how deeply given, were no guarantee of acceptance. The family I had devoted myself to had drawn a line, clear and unyielding, and I was on the other side. The laughter, the bill, Rachel's words, they all echoed inside me, searing a painful clarity. Sometimes family isn't about blood or shared history. Sometimes it's about respect, boundaries, and the courage to walk away when those are denied. And I knew, in that moment, that the next time I faced them, nothing would ever be the same. The house was quiet when I walked in that night. Too quiet. The familiar creak of the front door closing behind me felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. I carried the weight of that restaurant bill like a stone in my pocket, but it wasn't just the money that pressed down on me. It was the sting of Rachel's words, the ripple of laughter, the coldness in my parents' silence. The night's humiliation replayed relentlessly in my mind, each detail sharper than the last. I sat down at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the scattered papers and unopened mail. My hands trembled as I pulled out my notebook, the one I kept tucked away, filled with jotted memories, dates, and painful moments etched in ink. Flipping through the pages, I found the lines I had written after years of silent endurance, the loans made quietly to cover family debts, the unpaid bills I'd absorbed, the countless favors I'd done without complaint. There it was, all the invisible labor, the emotional energy spent trying to hold a family together that never seemed to want me fully inside. I ran my fingers over the pages, tracing the names and numbers that told a story no one else cared to see. There was the $15,000 I lent to David's struggling startup, money I had hoped would be repaid someday, or at least acknowledged, the dozens of late-night calls to soothe an irritable parent or broker peace between arguing relatives, the countless events I organized, many paid for out of my own savings, with no thanks or recognition. It felt like a ledger of sacrifice, marked not in profits but in wounds. With every tally, the grief that had gripped me earlier shifted, cooling into something harder, sharper, anger, cold, steady, unyielding anger. It wasn't the kind that burned and consumed in moments of fury. It was a measured, calculated fire that settled deep in my bones. I realized the truth I had been avoiding for too long. This wasn't just about one cruel dinner or one rude comment. It was a pattern, a system of exclusion and exploitation that had been built over years, carefully hidden beneath polite smiles and family facades. I thought back to the countless times I had swallowed my pride, numbed my pain, and put the family's needs before my own. I had believed, foolishly, that love and loyalty would eventually earn me a place at the table, not just a seat, but a voice, a presence that mattered. But that hope was fading fast, worn thin by Rachel's cutting words and the deafening silence of my parents. I closed the notebook with a snap, the sound echoing in the stillness of the kitchen. The fog of confusion and hurt lifted, replaced by clarity. They would never change. The family I had devoted myself to wasn't going to suddenly see me as an equal, as someone deserving of respect and inclusion. The truth was brutal, but it was also freeing. I owed them nothing. Not my sacrifices, not my money, not my dignity. A wave of resolve washed over me. No more silent suffering. No more carrying their burdens while they dismissed me as an outsider. I was done pretending that things would get better if I just tried harder. The time had come to set boundaries. Firm, unyielding boundaries that protected my heart and my family. I pictured the next family gathering. The familiar faces that had once felt like home but now looked like barriers. I knew I couldn't erase the past, but I could control my future. I could decide how much more emotional and financial energy I would pour into a family that refused to acknowledge me. I could reclaim my power, even if it meant standing alone. The anger didn't make me reckless. It made me focused. I began to think strategically, mapping out the ways I had supported the family and how I could begin to step back. It was not just about revenge. It was about survival, about preserving my sense of self in a world that had tried to diminish me. I looked out the kitchen window at the quiet street, the cool autumn air brushing against the glass. There was a strange calm in that moment, a stillness that felt like the eye of a storm. The laughter and the bill, the public shaming, had cracked something open inside me. I didn't know what the next chapter held, but I felt a flicker of strength rising from the ashes of that night. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with conflict and heartbreak, but I was no longer willing to walk it blindfolded. For the first time in years, I was ready to stand firm, ready to protect myself, ready to say no, and above all, ready to be seen, not as an adopted daughter or a convenient caretaker, but as Genevieve York, a woman with boundaries, with power, and with a voice they could no longer ignore. That night, as the echoes of the restaurant's laughter faded into silence, I found myself alone with my thoughts, the weight of years pressing down with new intensity. The humiliation wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror showing me all the invisible threads I'd been weaving into the family tapestry, threads they never truly valued. And yet, those very threads were what gave me power, if I knew how to hold them. I sat at my desk, surrounded by piles of papers, bills, and spreadsheets, the familiar tools of my trade. As a financial analyst, numbers don't lie, and for once, I welcomed their cold honesty. I pulled out my ledger, the one I kept meticulously updated with every family expense I'd managed, every loan I'd extended, every late payment I'd covered when no one else would. It was a map of my sacrifices, but it also revealed something else, my family's dependencies. I traced my finger down columns of numbers, thousands paid here, debts forgiven there, emergency funds tapped for urgent needs. Rachel's husband's failing startup was one glaring example. Tens of thousands of dollars quietly loaned, injected back into a business that everyone pretended was self-sufficient. I realized that I was the financial backbone holding up a shaky structure, propping up not just a failing business but also a carefully maintained illusion. My mind shifted from pain to calculation. This wasn't about emotional blackmail or petty revenge. It was about reclaiming my autonomy and rewriting the score. If I had been indispensable before, then perhaps now was the time to gently untangle myself from the web of obligations I had woven around the York family. I began to catalog everything: joint bank accounts I managed, credit cards where I was the primary payer, insurance policies I had set up, and family properties whose taxes I'd been covering. Each item was a piece of leverage, a potential boundary to deploy or a door to close if necessary. I wasn't naive. I knew these financial ties had kept me tethered to a family that barely acknowledged my existence beyond a resource. But it wasn't just about the money. I pulled out my old calendar, scanning years of family events I had organized. Birthdays, anniversaries, holiday dinners, even impromptu get-togethers when tensions ran high. For every celebration, there was my name attached to vendors, caterers, payments made out of my own pocket when funds ran short. I thought about the emotional labor too, the countless times I'd stepped in to mediate fights, to listen to grievances, to smooth over fragile relationships. Those moments had drained me, but the ledger had no columns for exhaustion. With each documented act of care and sacrifice, a new sense of clarity emerged. The family's so-called generosity was a one-way street. They welcomed my support, but never my presence, and certainly not my voice. I'd been the silent partner to their drama and their debts, a shadow who moved behind the scenes while they basked in the light. I reached for my notebook, worn and filled with notes, dates, and reminders of humiliations and injustices. Each entry was a reminder of what I had endured: Rachel's sharp words, my parents' silence, the exclusionary glances, the weighted phrase, "real family." As I read through the pages, a cold resolve hardened inside me. This was no longer about enduring or hoping. It was about asserting boundaries that would protect my heart and my future. The next step was practical. I needed to consult someone who understood the legal and financial ramifications of cutting ties and protecting assets. I made a mental note to reach out to my trusted attorney, a woman who had advised me before on personal financial matters and who could help navigate the complex terrain of wills, trusts, and family business agreements. It was time to ensure that my estate plan reflected the truths I had learned, that loyalty was conditional in this family, and so would be my legacy. I also began to draft a plan for gradual withdrawal. I would not make grand declarations or fiery confrontations. Those would play into the family's narratives of drama and victimhood. Instead, I would quietly shift control away from their grasp, step back from unpaid debts, delay payments strategically, and stop volunteering for emotional cleanup. The goal was to reclaim my time and energy, to let the structures they depended on subtly but surely crumble without my constant patchwork. Yet, amid this strategic retreat, I reminded myself to maintain the calm exterior the family expected. If I showed anger or hurt openly, they would dismiss it as weakness or manipulate it to their advantage. Instead, I would be the composed professional they had always known. Even as the foundation beneath their feet shifted, there was a strange satisfaction in this quiet planning. The knowledge that for years I had been underestimated, unseen, and unappreciated. But now, I held the keys to change. For the first time, the ledger wasn't just a record of sacrifice, it was a blueprint for reclaiming power. As I closed my notebook and organized the financial documents into neat folders, I felt a flicker of something new. Control. Not over the family, they were beyond that, but over myself. The family I had served so faithfully might never recognize my worth, but I would no longer serve at the expense of my dignity. Outside, the night deepened, the house settling into silence. Inside, a storm had taken shape, not one of chaos or fury, but one of deliberate, quiet strength. I was ready to rewrite my story, one calculated step at a time, knowing the path ahead would test me, but also free me. And somewhere in the shadows of that quiet night, I felt the first true pulse of hope. The days after that humiliating dinner blurred together in a strange mix of quiet tension and careful calculation. I didn't announce any grand changes or confrontations. Those would have played right into Rachel's hands, fueling the drama she seemed to thrive on. Instead, I began to pull back, subtly and deliberately, like a tide receding from a shore no longer willing to be shaped by constant erosion. First, I started with the financial lifelines I managed for the family. For years, I had been the one ensuring every bill was paid on time, every tax document filed, every joint account reconciled. It was an invisible job, tedious and thankless, but it kept the family business and daily life running smoothly. Now, I allowed things to slip, just a little at first. Payments I usually processed promptly were delayed by days, then weeks. I didn't ignore emails or calls, but my replies became slower, less detailed, carefully neutral. I noticed the subtle ripple effect immediately. A phone call from the family accountant mentioned a late payment on the property taxes. A brief message from Linda asked if I'd checked the utility bills. Each small oversight was a crack in the foundation I had quietly propped up for years. I didn't apologize. I didn't make excuses. I simply let the natural consequences unfold, watching as the family scrambled quietly to cover what I no longer caught in time. Next came the emotional labor, the caregiving, the event planning, the endless patchwork of smoothing over conflicts. I stopped volunteering for the medical appointments and check-ins with aging relatives. Where I once rearranged my schedule to coordinate family gatherings, I let invitations go unresponded or declined politely with vague explanations of being too busy. The elaborate holiday dinners I used to organize with painstaking detail didn't have my touch this year. The centerpieces were simpler, the menus less ambitious, and I avoided the usual frantic phone calls to vendors and caterers. Rachel noticed these changes quickly, though she never confronted me face to face. Instead, I heard through family whispers that she was grumbling about how Genevieve had suddenly lost her spark, or was too wrapped up in her own life to care anymore. Those words, meant to sting, bounced off something steely inside me. Let them think that. It wasn't my job to explain my choices to someone who had never valued my presence. I also began limiting my visits to the older relatives I used to care for so diligently. It was painful, in its own way, to pull back from those relationships, but I recognized that my own family, my husband Tom and our children, needed the attention and emotional space I had been giving away for so long. When I did visit, I was more intentional, less of a constant presence, setting boundaries around my time and energy in a way I never had before. The most significant shift was behind the scenes, where I held the keys to financial accounts and passwords. Over years, I had managed access to several shared bank accounts and online portals related to family properties and business dealings. Quietly, I changed passwords and altered permissions, ensuring that the family's access was no longer automatic or guaranteed. I informed the family business's accountant, under the guise of routine updates, that payments I had previously authorized would need to be reviewed before processing. It was a controlled, slow unwinding of the web I had woven around them. When Rachel called, often with urgent demands or veiled accusations, I responded with calm, clipped messages. No longer was I the eager caretaker ready to drop everything. My responses became measured and minimal, carefully avoiding engagement in her attempts to provoke or guilt-trip me. I refused to explain or justify my decisions. It was a new language for me, one of boundaries and self-preservation. The family noticed these changes, of course. There were whispers, sideways glances, and pointed comments made in hushed conversations. But to their surprise, my surprise too, the reactions were mostly dismissive on the surface. They chalked it up to temporary stress or personal issues, unwilling or unable to confront the deeper shift unfolding beneath the polite veneers. In some ways, that dismissal became my shield. They underestimated the quiet storm building beneath the calm. The tension simmered, unspoken, but palpable, like a room charged with electricity before a storm breaks. I felt it in the awkward silences on the phone calls, the subtle avoidance during family events, the way Rachel's smile sometimes faltered when I was near. Yet, through it all, I kept my composure. I remained the steady, reliable presence everyone expected, even as I quietly redefined the terms of my involvement. There was a strange power in this calm withdrawal, not the loud, angry rebellion I had once feared, but a firm, unyielding assertion of my own worth and limits. I was no longer invisible, no longer the silent servant to their needs. Instead, I was reclaiming space for myself, for my family, for the life I wanted to live without constantly sacrificing my dignity. The path ahead was uncertain, and the family's response was still to come. But for the first time in a long time, I felt the faint pulse of control beating steadily beneath the surface. And that control was mine alone. The day of the family meeting arrived with a quiet tension thick enough to cut through. It was a gathering none of us expected to approach with anything close to normalcy. The Yorks had convened at Martin and Linda's sprawling home, an estate where polished surfaces and curated elegance masked deeper fractures. The familiar buzz of polite small talk was there, but beneath it, I sensed the fragile equilibrium was about to shatter. I arrived carrying more than just a folder of documents. I carried the weight of years spent invisible, dismissed, and used. This time I was ready to speak, not as the quiet caretaker or the background fixer, but as a woman who had finally found her voice. The room filled with the usual suspects. Rachel, with her poised smile still brittle beneath the surface. Martin and Linda, their faces taut with guarded expressions, and a scatter of relatives and family business associates who had gathered, sensing something unusual in the air. As I stood before them, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. The old Genevieve, the one who swallowed humiliation and kept the peace, was no longer in the room. I opened my notebook, its pages filled with painstaking records of unpaid debts, loans extended, and emotional labor given without return. This would be my testimony. I want to be clear, I began, my voice steady but firm, that the years I've spent supporting this family financially and emotionally have not been acknowledged or respected. I have reached a decision, effective immediately. I am cutting all financial support to the family business, the shared accounts, and any other obligations I have carried alone. Eyes flickered around the room, surprise rippling through the faces. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line, her usual smirk gone for the moment. I could see Martin's jaw tighten, and Linda's eyes briefly dart to Rachel as though silently asking for damage control. But no words came from either of them. I pressed on. "Moreover," I said, lifting the legal documents I'd brought with me, "I have restructured my will to exclude Rachel and the biological children entirely. This decision was not made lightly, but after years of feeling marginalized and disrespected, I need to protect my own family and legacy." A stunned silence fell. Rachel's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening as if bracing for an attack. I could almost hear the unspoken accusations forming behind her gaze, but I stayed composed, letting the weight of my words settle. Then, turning to the financial records, I laid out the evidence, clear, undeniable proof of the tens of thousands of dollars I had quietly loaned to Rachel's husband's failing business, the late payments I had absorbed, and the countless family debts I had covered without complaint. I spoke calmly, but with conviction. The family had been living under the illusion of self-sufficiency, but in truth, I had been the invisible foundation holding it all together. Rachel's face flushed, shock and fury mingling there. "You've been financing us all along?" she hissed, voice low but venomous. "Yes," I replied, meeting her gaze. "And that ends now. From this point forward, respect and equality are not optional. If that can't be given, then I will have no choice but to distance myself permanently." The phrase hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Martin finally spoke, his tone measured but strained. "Genevieve, family is complicated. Maybe this is too harsh. It's the only way," I interrupted gently. "Too long have I been expected to give without being seen or valued. This is about boundaries and self-respect. I am not here to be a charity or a scapegoat." The room shifted. The atmosphere crackled with unease. Rachel's eyes darted to the others, searching for allies, but found none willing to openly challenge me. Linda's face betrayed a flicker of doubt, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. As the meeting adjourned, whispers swirled like smoke, speculation, shock, and the beginning tremors of panic. For the first time, the family's illusion of unity was broken, replaced by the raw reality that I was no longer the invisible pillar propping them up. Walking away from that gathering, I felt a strange mixture of relief and resolve. The path forward was uncertain, and the family's reactions would be unpredictable, but I had claimed my ground. No longer would I be the silent servant to their needs, or the invisible woman at the table. I had set the terms: respect, accountability, and equality, or permanent distance. And with that, the delicate balance of the York family began to shift irreversibly. The days after my announcement felt like a silent storm rolling across the York family's carefully maintained world. At first, the changes I had set in motion seemed to ripple beneath the surface, barely noticed by the casual observer. But soon enough, the cracks widened and the reality of my withdrawal hit hard. Bills began to bounce. Not just little ones, big ones. Property taxes were overdue. Utility payments lagged. The family business, once a smooth machine with me quietly keeping the gears oiled, sputtered under the sudden loss of my financial stewardship. I heard from the accountant that invoices were going unpaid, statements piling up, and vendors growing impatient. The foundation I'd spent years shoring up was suddenly exposed, and the Yorks scrambled to patch it together. Rachel was the first to react, and her response was swift, fierce, and exhausting. Instead of acknowledging what was happening, she launched into a barrage of emotional attacks. Phone calls flooded my inbox, some short and sharp, others dripping with guilt and manipulation. "Genevieve, you can't do this to us," she said one afternoon, her voice thick with false hurt. "We're family. Don't you care about what this will do to Mom and Dad? To all of us?" I listened quietly, the phone pressed to my ear, my heart steady, but guarded. "I care," I replied evenly, "which is why I have to do this. For my own sake and for my family." She sputtered, "You're ruining everything. Everyone depends on you. How could you be so selfish?" "I'm not being selfish. I'm setting boundaries," I said firmly. I've been carrying this weight alone for too long. But the guilt trips didn't stop there. Rachel tried to pit me against our parents, weaving stories designed to make me feel isolated and responsible for family fractures. She sent texts late at night, painting herself as the victim, lamenting how I was tearing the family apart. When I didn't respond, she escalated to passive-aggressive messages in group chats and subtle digs during family gatherings. The parents, Martin and Linda, found themselves caught in the middle. Their calls were hesitant, awkward, tinged with half apologies and pleas for peace. Linda's voice cracked as she murmured, "Can't we just find a way to fix this?" But there was no offer to acknowledge Rachel's cruelty or their own complicity. Martin was more reserved, his silence sometimes louder than words, a steady refusal to confront the deeper issues. Outside the immediate family, the fallout began to ripple too. Extended relatives, long loyal to Rachel's version of the story, started asking questions. Some whispered doubts about whether Rachel's narrative of innocence held up under scrutiny. Friends of the family who had always admired Rachel's charm found themselves hearing a different side, one where generosity was exploited and cruelty masked as family loyalty. As Rachel's support started to crumble, so did her carefully constructed image as the golden child. Without my financial and emotional scaffolding, cracks appeared in her confidence. Her social invitations became fewer. The business ventures she'd leaned on faltered without the money I had quietly provided. The family's facade of strength wobbled under the weight of reality. Through all this, I stood firm. I didn't engage in back-and-forth arguments or desperate attempts to placate. Instead, I focused on protecting my own family, Tom and the kids, whose well-being had too often taken a back seat to the York family's demands. I established new routines, more boundaries, and a peaceful silence where before there had been turmoil. Some relatives reached out with tentative sympathy, their voices tinged with regret or new understanding. Others dug in deeper, doubling down on blame, trying to cast me as the antagonist who shattered family harmony. But I no longer needed their approval or their acceptance. The York family's world was unraveling, piece by piece, financially, socially, emotionally. And as I watched from the periphery, I felt a bittersweet mix of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for what was lost, but relief that at last, the toxic cycle of exploitation and silence was breaking. The laughter that once filled the room in cruel mockery was replaced by an uneasy quiet. The balance of power had shifted, and the York family was left facing the consequences of their choices without the safety net I'd provided for so long. This was not the end of the story. It was the tremor before the earthquake, the beginning of a reckoning that would force all of us to confront truths long buried beneath polished smiles and guarded facades. And I was ready. The financial crises that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface erupted with a force that no one in the York family could ignore. Foreclosure notices began arriving at Martin and Linda's doorstep, each envelope a stark reminder of the cracks beneath their polished facade. The sprawling estate, once a symbol of their success and stability, now bore the weight of unpaid taxes and mounting debts. I saw it all unfold with a mix of grim satisfaction and profound sorrow. This was the fallout of years of neglecting the truth, of relying on me as an invisible safety net. At the same time, the family business began to falter conspicuously. Partners who had once hailed Martin's ventures as solid and reliable started pulling back, citing missed payments and mismanagement. The carefully curated image of the York enterprise took hits in quiet boardrooms and hushed phone calls. As vendors grew impatient and investors questioned the viability of ongoing projects, I wasn't the one calling these shots anymore. I had stepped back, and the consequences were immediate and severe. My withdrawal revealed just how much of the family's financial world depended on my unseen labor. Social invitations that had once arrived in glossy envelopes or carefully crafted emails became conspicuously scarce. The Yorks were no longer the gracious hosts or sought-after guests in their social circles. Gossip began to swirl, like a cold wind slipping through the cracks of their reputation. Friends and acquaintances whispered behind closed doors, speculating about the growing rifts within the family. Stories about financial troubles, emotional drama, and unspoken betrayals spread quietly but relentlessly. The York name, once whispered with admiration, now carried a curious mix of pity and judgment. Rachel's carefully maintained role as the golden child, the flawless, charismatic social organizer, began to crumble under the weight of these revelations. Without the financial and emotional scaffolding I had provided, she found herself isolated. Her social calendar thinned, invitations faded, and the veneer of control she once projected faltered. She lashed out in private conversations and public appearances alike, her confidence undermined by the growing reality that her success had been propped up by invisible hands, my hands. Her attacks against me escalated, morphing from subtle jabs to overt victim playing. She reached out to extended family members and mutual friends with rehearsed tales of betrayal and heartbreak, painting herself as the wronged daughter suffering under my supposed cruelty. I documented every message, every phone call, every attempt at manipulation. Her threats to take legal action were nothing more than desperate strikes, aimed at regaining lost control. But I was steady, unshaken by the theatrics. I knew the truth, and I had the proof. Meanwhile, Martin and Linda found themselves adrift in the chaos. Their silence, once a shield protecting their favored child, now felt like complicity. They made awkward, hesitant calls to me, pleas for peace, requests to reconsider, murmurs of regret that never acknowledged their part in the damage. Linda's voice sometimes trembled with emotion, but the words never fully formed into apologies. Martin's stoicism remained intact, but his withdrawal spoke volumes, a refusal or inability to confront the family's unraveling. Outside our immediate circle, the shifting alliances and whispered revelations began to change perceptions. Friends who had once admired Rachel's charm and success started to question the narrative they'd been told. Extended family members, once loyal and unquestioning, expressed cautious sympathy for me, some even sharing their own observations of the York family's dysfunction. The isolation that had once felt so suffocating began to lift, replaced by a cautious, fragile sense of clarity. Yet, for every step forward, there were setbacks. Some relatives dug in deeper, unwilling to see beyond Rachel's carefully spun story. They cast me as the antagonist, the disruptor of family harmony. Their words, sharp and defensive, tried to paint me as cold and unfeeling, but their voices were faint echoes against the growing chorus of truth. I chose not to engage. My focus remained on healing and protecting what truly mattered. My husband Tom, our children, and the life we were building beyond the shadows of the York family drama. The financial and social fallout was as much a reckoning as it was a liberation. The laughter that once rang like a weapon in the restaurant, the cruel jokes about real family, faded into uneasy silence. The York family, once a fortress of status and appearances, now stood exposed, fractured, vulnerable, and forced to face the consequences of years of neglecting the real foundations of family: respect, honesty, and genuine connection. As I watched from the edges, I felt no triumph in their downfall. Instead, there was a bittersweet sorrow, the kind that comes when a house you helped build begins to crumble. But I also felt something new: peace. For the first time in a long time, I was no longer the invisible pillar holding it all together. I was free to stand firm in my own worth, surrounded by those who saw me fully and loved me without condition. This was not a story of victory over others, but of reclaiming a life that had been overshadowed for too long. The tremors shaking the York family were just the beginning of a deeper reckoning, one that would test all of us to confront uncomfortable truths, and maybe someday offer a chance at real healing. But that was a future still unwritten. For now, I held fast to the quiet strength of my boundaries, the truth in my heart, and the family I had chosen to protect. The days and weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd ever experienced with the York family. The fractures I'd set in motion rippled outward, deepening into chasms that no polite conversation or forced smiles could bridge. I watched from a distance as the carefully constructed walls of their world began to crumble. Walls that had once seemed so solid, impenetrable, and untouchable. Financial strain gripped them like a relentless storm. Foreclosure notices arrived at my parents' doorstep, their polished estate suddenly feeling less like a home and more like a fragile shell. I knew the mounting debts and unpaid taxes weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were signs of a family unraveling from the inside out. The family business, once the centerpiece of Martin's success, faltered visibly as partners withdrew and suppliers became wary. The illusion of stability they'd maintained for so long was gone, exposed by the very absence of the support they had taken for granted. I didn't feel joy in their struggle, only a complex mix of sorrow and relief, knowing that the invisible safety net I'd been weaving for decades had finally been removed. Social invitations, once so frequent it was easy to assume the York name meant automatic inclusion, now dwindled to near silence. The chatter that once followed their gatherings shifted. Whispers of gossip replaced celebrations. Friends who had admired Rachel's charisma and effortless charm began to question the stories they'd been told. The carefully curated narrative of a flawless family was cracking, and with it, Rachel's status as the golden child began to erode. Rachel herself was a different person beneath the surface. The confident, dazzling social organizer was unraveling. Her social calendar thinned. Invitations stopped arriving, and her usual allies seemed uncertain of how to respond. I saw her lash out behind closed doors. The venom in her words barely disguised the fear and frustration that bubbled beneath. She tried to recast herself as the victim, painting me as the antagonist who had shattered the family's peace. Yet, every message she sent, every call she made, was carefully recorded, a shield I kept close against her desperate attempts to rewrite the story. At the heart of it all were my parents, Martin and Linda. Their silence was deafening. The calls I received from them were hesitant, laced with awkward apologies that never quite addressed the full truth. Linda's voice sometimes trembled with regret, but it was a quiet sorrow that felt more like mourning than accountability. Martin's stoic reserve remained, but his withdrawal spoke volumes. Neither seemed ready or willing to confront the toxic dynamics they had allowed to fester. In their silence, I found confirmation that my decision to set boundaries had been right. The shifting alliances beyond the immediate family surprised me. Some relatives, once loyal to Rachel's narrative, began to express tentative sympathy. They'd noticed the cracks I'd tried so hard to conceal, and their cautious voices brought a fragile sense of validation. Friends and acquaintances who had once admired Rachel's polished veneer now shared whispers of concern and doubt. The isolation that had once felt suffocating began to lift, replaced by a cautious clarity. But not everyone welcomed the change. Some relatives dug in, blaming me for the family's unraveling, casting me as the disruptor of peace. Their words were sharp and defensive, trying to paint me as cold and unfeeling. I chose not to engage. There was no need. I had finally learned that my worth wasn't tied to their approval or their acceptance. My focus remained on healing and protecting the family I had chosen. My husband Tom, our children, and the circle of friends who truly saw me. Through it all, the laughter that once rang through the York family's gatherings, the cruel laughter that had punctuated my exclusion, faded into uneasy silence. The power dynamics shifted. The family that had once dismissed me as an outsider was forced to face the consequences of their cruelty and neglect. They were no longer shielded by my silent sacrifices. As I watched this transformation unfold, I felt no triumph in their downfall. What I felt was a bittersweet sorrow, the kind that comes when a house you helped build begins to collapse. But alongside that sorrow was a newfound peace. For the first time, I was no longer the invisible pillar holding their world together. I was free to stand firm in my own worth, surrounded by those who loved me without condition. This chapter of my life was not about victory over others. It was about reclaiming myself, reclaiming my dignity, and defining family on my own terms. The tremors shaking the York family marked the start of a reckoning, one that would likely be long and painful, but I was ready. I had set my boundaries clearly: respect, accountability, and equality, or permanent distance. I embraced the family I chose, not the one that rejected me. And in that choice I found strength, the quiet, unshakable strength of a woman who would no longer be invisible or diminished. The future was still unwritten. But whatever came next, I knew one thing with certainty: true family is built on love and respect, not just blood.